In my book, Creative Systems Theory, I divide the most commonly encountered views of the future into 5 scenarios, to use the language of futurists. These are we've arrived scenarios, we've gone astray scenarios, post-industrial information age scenarios, postmodern constructivist scenarios, and transformational new paradigms scenarios. In contrasting them with the concept of cultural maturity, I describe how each stops short of providing effective guidance. I also delineate how each is best thought of less as a product of reasoned consideration, and as how the world looks from a particular kind of limited ideological perspective. That the first 2 differ fundamentally from the concept of cultural maturity's more systemic perspective, where it takes us as most obvious. Culturally mature perspective makes clear that modern age belief is not an endpoint. We have not yet arrived. It also emphasizes that going forward in rewarding ways is very much an option. Neither have we gone astray, at least in some ultimate way. The remaining 3 scenarios share with the concept of cultural maturity that each supports both that further chapters in the human story lie ahead, and that these further chapters have the potential to be positive. But in the end, their conclusions are again fundamentally different and stop fundamentally short of what is ultimately required. The kind of polarization between the political right and the political left that I addressed in Perspective and Guidance for a Time of Deep Discord most often reduces to we've arrived or we've gone astray scenarios. But at times we also find bits of the other 3 more future-oriented ways of thinking implied in them. Because people can confuse these 3 more positive, future-oriented ways of thinking with what the concept of cultural maturity describes, I'll do a separate compare and contrast episode for each. Here I start with post-industrial information age scenarios. Post-industrial information age interpretations treat invention as the fundamental driver of cultural change, and emphasizes the transforming effects that inventions of the future will have in every part of our lives. Often they make technology the ultimate solution. Such views are common in popular culture and academic thought and find special favor in futurist circles. The digital revolution has given such beliefs a new generation of adherents. Culturally mature perspective affirms technology's essential role in future possibilities and also applauds many post-industrial information age ideas. But at the same time, it directly challenges much in at least the more simplistic of post-industrial information age interpretation. Most obviously, it does so in cautioning against the assumption that the consequences of invention will necessarily be positive. It reminds us that inventing is not at all the same thing as using invention wisely. It also emphasizes that technological solutions will rarely in themselves be sufficient for addressing the tasks ahead. The most limited of post-industrial information age thinking simply extends the industrial age's onward and upward story, and thus contributes little to the needed greater maturity of perspective. But post-industrial information age thinking can also alert us to many of the questions culturally mature perspective addresses. It is also a case that the best of post-industrial information age thought can put forward ideas that are nearly as far-reaching in their implications as those offered by more explicitly culturally mature writings. For example, Alvin Toffler and John Naisbitt, who produced some of the best early futures-oriented thinking for a popular audience, addressed broad cultural concerns. And some of the more insightful commentators on the information revolution today have reflected on specific important social issues. We see this result for two very different reasons. First, there is the fact that emerging technologies often serve to support and catalyze cultural maturity-related changes. The fact that global access to technologies can make possible greater resource efficiency, for example, will be critical to long-term environmental sustainability. And emerging technologies can support not just needed changes in what we do, but also in how we think. We see this with how decentralized information technologies can thrust us into systemically networked realities that just by their structures transcend conventional expertise and authority. A second reason we may see related predictions is a product of unwarranted conclusions. Post-industrial information age thinkers can predict outcomes that, while superficially accurate, are not really supported by post-industrial information age interpretation. Post-industrial information age thinkers can assume, for example, that the greater connectedness that comes with globalization or with new information technologies will by itself produce a more peaceful and caring world. Culturally mature perspective warns that if the results are not instead to be ever greater and more dangerous conflict, changes in the ways we think and relate will be required. We find another example in theorists who observe some of the more positive possible effects of decentralized information technologies and then talk as if the psychological and social changes needed for a healthy future will follow naturally from them. This prediction is again not supported, certainly if we're talking about the depth of psychological and social changes required for wise future decision-making. Indeed, a common result of new information technologies is to compound one of our time's greatest problems, growing addiction to artificial stimulation and pseudo-significance. At the least, technological advances by themselves do nothing to counter it. Culturally mature perspective applauds contributions made by the more sophisticated of post-industrial information age thinkers, and at the same time it warns even those who make an effort to think in more encompassing ways that they need to re-examine their explanation if their ideas are to hold up, and more importantly, if their ideas are to ultimately serve us as we go forward. Post-industrial information age interpretation and the concept of cultural maturity more explicitly part company regarding the common post-industrial information age assumption that technological invention is what ultimately drives cultural change. Culturally mature perspective affirms the importance of technology as one driver of change, but it also emphasizes that this explanation in isolation leaves out much of what is most significant for understanding change and, more importantly, for usefully addressing the future. It argues that, more accurately, the causality goes both ways. Invention catalyzes change, but what we are capable of inventing is always also a function of who we are and how we are able to understand and perceive. In particular, invention reflects our time in culture story, an illustration. While China had all the technical prerequisites for an industrial revolution 2,000 years ago, it lacked the materialist, individualist values needed to make such change acceptable and successful. Today, this is changing in very basic ways. With regard to today's needed changes, invention helps drive and support cultural maturity, but it is just as true that invention sufficiently innovative to push us toward needed changes could not happen, and certainly would not be supported without the new sensibilities and perspectives that cultural maturity begins to make possible. Another way in which culturally mature perspective takes issue with post-industrial information age assumptions concerns just what needed changes in how we understand, if recognized, entail. The best of post-industrial information age thinking affirms the importance not just of technical advancement, but also of new ways of thinking. And there can be similarities in the kinds of conceptual changes proposed. We often see emphasis, for example, on the importance of systemic understanding. But here, again, limited assumptions of how things work. In this case, a strong mechanistic bias tend to get in the way of the needed sophistication of conceptual perspective. What we encounter is rarely more than systemic understanding of the simple engineering sort. Culturally mature perspective emphasizes the importance of systems thinking that reflects the fact that we are living beings. We can miss the strong ideological component that commonly permeates post-industrial information age thinking for the simple reason that such thinking emphasizes much that we most mythologize in our time. Post-industrial information age assertions can simply appear smart and logical. The hidden ideological thread becomes most apparent when such interpretation takes the utopian turn. Think of science fiction like prognostications from the middle of the previous century that claimed we should all now be living in glass-enclosed cities and flying around in personal transporters. We also encounter this ideological component in knee-jerk conclusions that with any close examination become questionable at best. Consider the common assumption in artificial intelligence circles that computers will soon become more intelligent than we are. In a purely computational sense, they are already more intelligent, indeed much more so. Belief that they might become more intelligent than we are in ways that are most important to us, that can guide us in having meaningful relations and crafting creative and purposeful lives, reflects decidedly limited and ultimately ideological ideas about the nature of intelligence. This distinction becomes particularly critical if our concern is the wisdom-related cognitive capacities that will be increasingly important to us in the future. We encounter a related sort of ideological belief with supposedly scientific conclusions that reduce to a narrow scientism. Such conclusions and techno-utopian thinking have the same origins, extension of the modern age belief that it is all great clockworks to an absurd, idealized extreme. Narrow scientism is remarkable as much for what its thinking leaves out as for what it emphasizes. I think of a well-known cognitive scientist's conclusion that music has no real evolutionary significance, that in the end music is just ear candy. It is not common to find dreams referred to as nothing more than random neural stimulation in such circles. We often find a related absolute dismissing of spiritual experience in such thinking. Richard Dawkins, the most familiar exponent of such scientifically based atheism. Creative systems theory provides explanation for these absurd conclusions. It describes how the non-computation parts of intelligence, music, dreams, and the spiritual each draw on what it calls more archetypally feminine or left-hand aspects of systemic makeup and the aspects of intelligence they draw on. It goes on to describe how archetypally feminine sensibilities have evolved through history, having greatest influence in earliest cultural times, then gradually diminishing in influence over culture's course, and today often becoming nearly invisible. Any at all complete systemic formulation requires thinking that takes into account the contributions of both left-hand and right-hand cognitive aspects. The fact that techno-utopian belief is based on an absolutist polar identification means that it represents not just ideology, but ideology of a particularly fundamentalist sort. and the fact that it reflects polar identification with the archetypally masculine right-hand sensibilities means that such ideology, because we are vulnerable to confusing it with the kind of new clarity the future is requiring us, can be especially dangerous. The pivotal influence of digital technologies today can combine with transitional dynamics to produce particularly extreme forms of techno-utopianism. We see this most dramatically with Anything is Possible special effects imagery in the media. But we also encounter it in views expressed by acknowledged serious thinkers. I'm reminded of recent claims by techno-utopian guru Ray Kurzweil that artificial intelligence, by offering the option of wholly disembodied existence, will make eternal life finally possible. Besides being a conclusion that again depends on a naively simplistic picture of intelligence, this conclusion reflects an ultimate limits-denying ambition that is a giveaway for ideology. Extreme expressions of a technological gospel can titillate, but they are best thought of as what creative systems theory calls transitional absurdity. In summary, post-industrial information age interpretations, while sometimes helpful, most often stop well short of providing the completeness of perspective our times demand. Indeed, because such interpretations tend to leave out so much that needs to be considered as we go forward, not just how personal change must be, but also how deeply in ourselves it will require that we reach, they often work to hide us, in fact, from the depths of what our times require. They may provide imagery that excites, but they fail to give us an at all complete picture of what the future will require. Technological advancement is wonderful, but it is only part of what we need for a future that is worth living. I find this common sense.